So these last several weeks in our devotionals, since I was on sabbatical, we have been looking at these places where the church had particular moments of growth, and how the early church kind of began with this telling of the story of Jesus, and how it began to expand through fellowship, how they faced controversy, and they were able to continue to move and grow as a church. And we've been looking at these things because as we look at the church today, perhaps some of those things that happened in that early church can inform us in such a way that we as the church now might be able to use some of those things that this early church did as examples for what we can do today. So the context of this particular devotional now is right after that period of time that I said in the last devotional, where they had picked new leaders to help deal with the expanding needs of the church, and they had picked these deacons who were going to do the ministry to the needy. The next thing that happens in the story of the book of Acts is that one of those who was picked, the one that was mentioned first, Stephen, he began to boldly preach the message of the gospel. Now, when Peter preached it, it was pretty much received very favorably. By the time Stephen preaches it, there's not all the favorable reception that Peter got. In fact, when Stephen began to teach and preach about Jesus, those who heard him felt like he was messing with the status quo so much that they felt this message needed to stop. And so Stephen was essentially arrested, or was taken under control, and as he continued to preach the gospel, they got so enraged hearing his sharing the story of Jesus that he was martyred. They took up stones and they killed him. And after that, you would think that the growth of the church is going to stop, right? It's going to end right there. In fact, it sounds like it may, because here is how Acts chapter 8 begins. That day that Stephen was martyred, that day a severe persecution against the church in Jerusalem and all except the apostles were scattered throughout the countryside and in Judea and Samaria. Devout men buried Stephen and made loud lamentations over him. But Saul, who later becomes Paul and becomes an asset to the church, not at this time yet, but Saul was ravaging the church by entering house after house and dragging both men and women out. He committed them to prison. I mean, look at what's going on. So here the church has had this massive growth, and it's began to have an effect on the broader community. But oftentimes when that happens, those people that want to keep status quo begin to push back. And that's what begins to happen at the church. And it sounds as if, they're scattered about. It sounds as if the whole church is beginning to be dispersed. Those communities of faith begin to fade away, right? That's not what happens. Listen to what happens next in verse 4. Now those who were scattered went from place to place. Listen to what they did. They proclaimed the word. Philip went down to the city of Samaria and proclaimed the Messiah to them. The crowds with one accord listened eagerly to what was said by Philip, hearing and seeing the signs that he did. For unclean spirits, crying out in loud shrieks, came out of many who were possessed, and many others who were paralyzed or lame were cured. So was a great joy in the city. And it goes on to say that as that began to happen, more and more people began to respond to the ministry of the church. What happens in this particular part of the story and the growth of the church is once pushback begins, once pushback against the church happens, rather than scattering off afraid and in hiding, they scattered and they began to extend the ministry of the church to places that perhaps when everything was peaceful, no one ever imagined that it was going to go. You see, the point I think for us in the church today is oftentimes when we get pushback from the community around us, from the society around us, from the culture around us that doesn't like what we're doing, we begin to pull ourselves back in such a way that we stop sharing, or we become victimized where it becomes more us versus them. But there is that old cliche It's a couple ways of saying it. One is when one door closes, another one opens. Another way of saying that is when one chapter ends, another begins. Every setback is a setup for a comeback. With every ending comes a new beginning. Obstacles are stepping stones to new horizons. Embrace change, for it brings fresh pathways. I mean, there are all kinds of cliches, and whatever cliche works for you. The point is, for that early church, when things got tough, they didn't stop. They continued to find ways to share the gospel. And they didn't do it by beating people over the head. They didn't do it by becoming even more defensive. They simply did it by going into those places and they shared the story of Jesus. That's what Philip did. He shared the story of Jesus and he found ways to help those who were broken and in need. And through the power of the Holy Spirit, once again, the church grew. When things get tough, those people of faith recognize where God is in their midst, and they respond accordingly, and they continue to be committed to sharing the life-saving story and that grace of God in Jesus Christ. Perhaps we need to hear that message again as the church when we feel pushback, rather than finding that what we got to do is we've got to share our anger on Facebook. Maybe what we got to do is just find a way to share the story of Jesus with someone that needs to hear it. Find a way to reach out in care and grace. That was how the early church responded to persecution and struggle. They continued to share the love of God in Jesus Christ.